In this video, we cover Game 4 of the 2021 World Chess Championship. My name is Nathan, and this is MTX Chess. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game 4 of the 2021 World Chess Championships between Grandmasters Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachthci. So, Game 4, we have Magnus with the white pieces. Both players had a rest day yesterday. And today is also Magnus's birthday, so happy birthday to Magnus, and let's just jump right in. So Magnus opens with e4. Everyone was excited to see what he would open with. If you remember from game 2, when Magnus last had the white pieces, he started with d4 and we had a Catalan. After e5 from Nepo, knight f3, we have knight f6. And this move really surprised Magnus. This is the Petrov Defense, and Ian Nepomniachthci really doesn't play this opening at all. So it was surprising to everybody, but I think especially to Magnus to see this opening over the board. So we have the Petrov on the board. After knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, black continues with knight takes e4, picking off that central pawn. Here there's a couple options for white. White could play knight c3, and usually what will happen is you'll get an exchange on the c3 square. White will take back with the d-pawn. They'll get this nice open bishop. They'll have a semi-open d-file. Instead of doing any of that, Magnus elected to continue with d4. And after d5, bishop d3, bishop d6, just kind of some normal developmenting moves. Castle kingside, c4. White makes an attack here on the center. Black's going to support their center with c6. After rook e1, bishop f5. White develops their queen with queen b3. Black plays queen d7. And here we have a series of exchanges, and right now we're only on about move 10 of the game, and already we're going to see some pieces come off the board. White has to continue developing, so they play knight c3. Nepo's going to capture. Bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, and b takes c3. So obviously, white has some doubled pawns here on the c-file. This is really not that much of a problem for Magnus. These pawns can, this c4 pawn can get exchanged for the d-pawn. Both players have to complete their development. Obviously, black has to develop their knight. White has to find a good square for their dark squared bishop. Here, there's a couple different lines where, for instance, if the knight gets developed or if a different move gets played, white has the option of taking here on b7 with a threat on the rook. So, for instance, after d takes c, white would have this option here. And you may think this is really bad for black simply because this rook is going to get picked off by the white queen. But the reality is, if, let's say, black plays a move like this, and the rook gets picked off on a8, black has this move here, queen d7. And now it gets very difficult for white to get this queen out of the corner here. And so this square is obviously covered, this pawn's covered by the queen, this pawn's defended by the queen, and this knight is defended by both the bishop and the rook. So kind of unpleasant for white. So it may look like this b pawn is very weak, but it's difficult for white to capitalize on anything with the b pawn. Nevertheless, Nepo decides to play b6, shoring up that weak b pawn. And here Magnus sees kind of a simplifying tactic. So Magnus plays c takes d5, and after c takes d5, we have this really nice queen b5. And so what's going on here? Obviously, this pawn is under attack, and Nepo would love to develop his knight to this d7 square. The problem with knight d7 is that white now has queen c5, and there's really no way to defend both these pieces. The queen can't come to e6 to defend because the rook. And so one of these pieces is going to have to move and the other one's going to fall. So obviously that would not work. And so the best move for black in this position is the move that Nepo found, and that is queen d7. So if we go back, Magnus in this position realized that exchanging c takes d5 really is going to lead to a queen trade. Now you might be asking, why can't white simply take the d5 pawn? Well, if white takes the d5 pawn, can you find the winning move for black? So yeah, the winning move for black is bishop takes h2 check. The king or the knight has to capture back, and in the meantime, the queen gets picked off. So queen takes d5 would have been a blunder. Obviously, Magnus is not going to go for that. Plays queen takes d7. Or excuse me, actually, in this scenario, there's a couple different things Magnus could have done. Magnus could have played queen takes d7 right away, but he elected instead to play a4. And all these are moves that have been played before. This is a line that has been played in a couple Grandmaster games. So a couple players were thinking that maybe white exchanges here, and after the knight takes, white plays a4, and they have this really nice a4 pawn opposing these two black pawns right here. But instead, white elected to play a4 right away. Nepo goes for the queen trade, and after a takes b5, I think Nepo, showing his preparation in this game, really didn't hesitate at all and played a5 right away. Why is this a5 move so important? Well, this passed a pawn is a real positional advantage for black, and really you'll see later in the game this passed a5 pawn really becomes black's saving grace. So in this position, there's a couple moves. There's really only one move that gets played for white, and that is b takes a5 en passant, and that's definitely an option Magnus had. But if we look at this position right here, white has this key weakness on c3, black has this key weakness on d5, this isolated pawn, and black has a slight, I'd say, positional advantage simply because of this pass pawn. So b takes a6 or a5 here, en passant, is really the move that is most often chosen simply to neutralize this passed a pawn. Magnus played a novelty here, and I think it surprised a lot of people just with the speed at which he played it. After a5 was played, he played this very quickly, and the move that Magnus played was knight h4. So move 18, we already have a novelty from Magnus, and we have a complete new game in this position. So what's the idea with knight h4? Well, a couple different things. The knight can come to f5 and put pressure on the bishop. The knight can come to f5 and put pressure on this e7 square, which is controlled very nicely by the rook. And that with the goal eventually being the knight remaneuvering perhaps to f5 and then to e3 to put pressure on this weak d5 square. If we consider black's position for a second, this d5 square is really the only core weakness of black's position. A very logical move from Nepo is g6, which is what he played, and that basically takes away this f5 square. And here Magnus was away from the board when this move was played, and when he got back to the board, he immediately, without hardly sitting down, played g4. And so everyone was really excited, thinking, my goodness, here we are in move 19 in a line that's never been seen before, and it seems that Magnus is still in his preparation, just whipping moves out. And people were very excited trying to figure out what the idea was between this kind of odd knight h4 followed by this g4 move. If you wanted the knight to come to g2 and then to e3, so the knight ends up putting pressure on this d5 square eventually, why not just play g3? So I think everyone was a little bit excited to see g4 get played. The knight has to get developed, so the d7, the knight comes out to d7. One reason when after g4 was played, people were speculating that, well, if the knight wants to come to f6 and eventually defend here on d5, this g4 pawn could be very useful in pushing g5 to cover this f6 square. And because the knight won't be able to come to this f6 square, this pawn becomes very weak. That was one idea behind g4. Again, Magnus playing very quickly, plays knight g2. And again, everyone was just really excited to see Magnus rattle off a couple of moves here in the late middle game. Moves that people believe were part of his preparation. Nepo rattled off a couple quick moves himself. He played rook fc8. The computer says a little bit of an inaccuracy. The computer was recommending knight f6 right away, and after bishop h6, then rook fc8, and after knight e3, you can pick this pawn off, and this pawn's protected. But after g5, knight d7, knight takes d5, I think it's even either way. But the one thing for black, though, is this bishop's a little bit worse, simply because the bishop's kind of locked in here by the pawn. But obviously none of that happened. Rook fc8 was played right away, and here white plays bishop f4. And so what do you do in this position as black? If you move your bishop back to f8, for instance, if Nepo were to play bishop f8, white has knight e3, and what's effectively happened in the last two moves is black has retreated their bishop, white has established their bishop on a great diagonal, and they've started to advance their knight into the position to put pressure on this weakness. And obviously this pawn's going to fall at some point because the knight can't come to f6 to protect it because you'll have g5 right away. So Nepo makes the wise decision, really the only good move for him, and that is just to exchange the bishops. And after knight takes f4, it's really unclear where white's advantage went. So after knight h4 and g4 and knight back to g2, everyone was really excited, thinking that Magnus had some tricks up his sleeve. But we get to this position, we realize that Nepo's defended really well, and there's really not much for white. After rook takes c3, we get knight takes d5, so basically an exchange of pawns. Here, there's a couple different options for black. Black obviously has to move this rook because it's under attack. Black can either come to d3, or Nepo can move the rook to b3. I think Nepo made the wise decision in moving the rook to d3. This pawn's more important than this pawn, and the reality is, if the rook comes to b3, this pawn's really not under, this pawn's basically protected because white always has the tactic of knight c7 with a fork on the rook on a8 and the pawn here on b5, on the pawn here b5, or the rook on b5 if black were to capture. So Nepo plays what I think to be the best move, rook d3. Here, and this is always just a theme in all kind of rook pawn endgames, you want to get your rook on the 7th rank. So Magnus does exactly that, placing his rook very nicely. This knight doesn't really have any squares. If you move here, you're blocking this rook in. This rook becomes kind of awkward. The knight obviously can't come here because of the pawn. The pawn covers these squares. Knight can't come here because it would hang, so the only square for the knight is knight f8. Here we have knight f6 from Carlsen. And king g7. King g7 is basically forced. If the king comes to h8, we've got rook takes f7, and with ideas, if this knight ever moves, of the rook capturing on h7 with checkmate. So that would obviously be a problem for black. Also, black just doesn't want to give up the pawn. So after king g7, we have king e8 check, and after king g8, d5. So what's the idea here? Why is this pawn not hanging? If black makes the mistake of capturing this pawn, well, white has really two options. They can fork the knights on c7, or probably a better move even would be forking the king and the rook and just winning it outright. So after knight f6 check, you get a fork on the rooks that way. And so this knight, even though it's kind of awkward, looks like it's awkwardly placed against the side of the board, is really doing a lot to shore up white's position. So Nepo, being a grandmaster, obviously doesn't go for any of that and simply pushes a4. And so this is where we're going to start to see this a pawn really become a very useful, a huge asset for Nepo here in the end game. Obviously, white and black, they could just exchange pawn moves down to the end of the board. The problem is that with white's king on this g1 square, black's always going to have opportunities to maybe move the rook over, check on b1, and it's just going to be hard for white to defend this pawn. Here, Magnus played knight f6, and after king g7, g5, basically shoring up this knight. And the idea being that if white can ever get down to the 8th rank and scoot their knight back here, they could get a nice little checkmate here on g8. And it's just a nice positional move, preventing the black king from escaping, and ensuring basically that Magnus would have a draw if he wanted. So Magnus could always dance his knight back and forth and get a draw by repetition. Here, a3 was played. Again, black just pushing the pawn kind of towards the end of the board. Magnus went into a really deep think here, and his next move was knight e8. And this move took him about 40 minutes to consider. And obviously, he wasn't considering knight e8. He knows that he can just play back and forth to reach time control. But if you remember the way time control works in these world championships, both players get 2 hours on their clock for the first 40 moves, and then at move 40, they get an additional hour added, and then at move 60, they get an additional 15 minutes added. So I think Magnus spent a lot of time just considering, because he has a draw here, again, by repetition. And so considering, okay, is there a way for me to break through? Should I just take the draw? And after about 40 minutes, I think he played knight e8 simply to get an extra couple moves in to get us closer to time control. He's at move 30 right here, so about 10 more moves before the time control. King g8, knight f6, king g7. And again, Magnus went into a deep think here. And so as white, I mean, in this position, what are you considering? There are a couple different moves that can happen. So a lot of people were thinking, oh, h4 could happen. And what would basically, after h4, you're basically baiting black into pushing a2. And the reason why you're kind of baiting black into this is because after a2, white has rook e2. And now this pawn becomes a little bit difficult to defend. And if, for instance, black tries to hold on to this pawn, there are different ideas of, now that this black rook is off this d3 square, of pushing d6, and, maybe they'll have to come back to a7 and trying to maneuver the pawn down the board. That's one option. So h4, giving black the opportunity to make a mistake, pushing a2, allowing white some counterplay on the second rank. That was one idea. Another idea was here d6. So the d6, it looks like the pawn's hanging. Why wouldn't this work for black? And that's simply because knight e8 forks. So white has the option of playing d6 here, and it was actually after the game that Magnus and Nepo spent a little bit of time talking about this d6 move in this position, because obviously the rook can't take, so the best move for black would be knight e6, and then after d7, black has rook d8. And so what do you do here as white? Obviously, if you come down here, if you move the rook down, black is just going to have either they can play h6, and you can't checkmate because the black rook will take you, or they could play rook takes d7, and for instance, if we could get exchanges this way, or we could get exchanges this way. Either way they end up being. If the computer let me do it, get exchanges this way. Either way, it ends up very even position. This a pawn is going to fall, and this is just a dead draw. So I don't think Magnus could. Well, we know that Magnus couldn't see a way to break through here in this position. H4 wasn't going to work. There was no way to successfully push d6 to queen, and so Magnus played e8 again. And after king g8, knight f6, Nepo called the moderators over because they were about to have a 3-move repetition, and it was in this position on move 33 that the players agreed to a draw. So an interesting game 4. Obviously, I think a lot of people are upset that we're getting so many draws, but the reality is these players are playing at such a high level, it's so difficult to win. The margin of victory is so small, and you have to work with such small advantages to convert in these really high-level games. This was an exciting game, in my opinion. Nepo came out playing the Petrov Defense, which I don't think Magnus was expecting. Even though Magnus wasn't expecting it, he had this really interesting knight h4 novelty on move 18, and then followed by g4, and then knight coming back to g2. So some interesting maneuvering from white. I think everyone was really excited, but turned out that Nepo just is too strong in terms of his defense. So game 5 is tomorrow. It'll be interesting to see what Nepo does with the white pieces, if he's going to go for his third Ruy Lopez against Magnus, who is just really unstoppable with the black pieces when it comes to defending against the Ruy. So yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow, game 5. Please like, share, comment, and you can always hit me up on chess.com. My username is mtxchessofficial. Look forward to game 5 tomorrow. All right, take care.